I think you and I share a very broad view of design, which is that to me, Craigslist is well designed. The first version of Google is well designed. Does it look beautiful? Is it always intuitive? Is it polished and whatever? No, but it solves this problem that people have, and it's very successful.
I'm Ron Jor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. John Zeratsky is a best-selling author of Sprint and Make Time, and has reached millions with articles in the Wall Street Journal, Time, Harvard Business Review, Wired, Fast Company, and other outlets. He's a former design partner at GV, that is Google Ventures, where he developed the design sprint methodology alongside former guest of the podcast, Knapp, and where he supported many of GV's most successful investments, including Slack, One Medical, and Blue Bottle Coffee. Before that, John was a design leader for YouTube, Google Ads, and FeedBurner. Today, John is a co-founder and general partner at Character, a venture fund where he supports technology startups with capital and sprints. In this conversation, we talk about his childhood, where he learned a strong orientation towards service, being a Boy Scout, and where he learned that he doesn't have to accept the way things are, that he can play with them, that he can challenge the status quo. We talk about his career as a designer before getting into GV, first working at FeedBurner, then after the acquisition by Google, working at Google Ads, and eventually leading design on the YouTube channels feature at YouTube, which is a big feature. We also talk about the particulars of being a designer at Google at the time, where he felt like he had to present hard data and actually learn how to code to even get a seat at the table. We discuss his time at GV, where he was brought in as a successful designer at YouTube to help companies, portfolio companies, benefit from his design experience alongside the other design partners, which eventually led to the creation and iteration of the design sprint. We also talk about their process of writing the sprint book and the Make Time book, and how they treated it like any other design process. And finally, we talk about Character, their new venture fund, and John's idea of starting a fund as a way to create alignment again between him as a designer and the companies he serves. It was really interesting to talk to John about all of these things. I think we have a lot of shared interests in understanding the human side of the equation, the human side of the system. We both care about making things better and figuring out what's really going to be better. And we're both very interested in the wisdom of how we use our short lives on this planet. This conversation with John is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, impact investors, and more. We're working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app, or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. Now, whenever we mention something in this episode, and in fact in every episode, whether it's a book or an article, a product, another resource, we make sure to include the links in the show notes. So please remember to check out the show notes. I promise you they're worth it. Every episode is full of relevant resources, and this episode is no different. And so now let's jump right in with John Zeratsky. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from John Zeratsky. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And so usually these days we start with a COVID check-in. We've been doing this. I thought it would be just for a few months, but I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's still interesting. So I'd love to hear where in the world you were when, this came upon us. How did it affect your personal life? How did it affect your work life? What did you learn? Anything that's worth sharing about the COVID experience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's something I think about a lot just because it has been such a tumultuous couple of years. But depending on how I look at it, I'm either amazed at how much has changed or amazed at how much hasn't changed for me. Because on the one hand, obviously, everything's been thrown into disarray, so much uncertainty, so much fear and anxiety, and just like a whole new set of risk assessments and decisions to make. But on the other hand, like I've always been into solo work and, focus time to work and really pay attention to projects. My wife and I, before the pandemic, for a couple of years, we actually lived on a sailboat and we were traveling through Central America. So we were very comfortable living together in small spaces. And we actually moved to where I am right now, which is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the US. We moved here before the pandemic. So we moved here in 2019, just as sort of a life slowdown type of move following the sailing trip that I mentioned. And since then, we know a lot of people who have relocated because of the pandemic, or maybe COVID caused them to reassess or see things differently, or realize they didn't need what they thought they needed, or they needed something they didn't have before. But for us, it was an independent move, but one that we have been very happy about, because Milwaukee is a nice city. It's a city, but it's not quite as dense. It's not quite as difficult. And the sort of like the two sides of the coin with how Milwaukee and Wisconsin have reacted to the pandemic, on the one hand, have been lackluster in terms of staying on top of it. But on the other hand, at times it's been nice to not have really extreme restrictions or lockdowns. So we've been able to make our own decisions about how much risk we want to take on and what sorts of activities that we want to do. Really, the big thing is that it just created a lot of space, a lot of workspace to initially explore some projects that were related to make time and to sprint, and then eventually made it, I think, not easier, but more possible to start Character, which is the new VC firm. Because I think if the pandemic hadn't happened, I probably just would have continued to put one foot in front of the other and keep doing what I had been doing, which was speaking and training and advising and consulting. And having that forced slowdown gave me a chance to reconsider, and then a whole bunch of time to work on stuff. So, always difficult to look back and say what would have happened differently. But I do think it was a pivotal moment for some of the decisions I was making about what I wanted to work on and focus on.
Yeah, no, I've experienced similar things. Like, so this podcast was a dream for a long time, and I had a couple of episodes even recorded, but it was like, kind of a dream. And then COVID came and a bunch of sprints canceled. And I suddenly found myself with nothing but time, and I doubled down on the podcast, and I'm so happy I did. And it's a part that I would never consider giving up. And also, one thing that I heard that I really vibed with is the culture of the place really affecting the experience of COVID. And one thing that I feel very fortunate about being in Israel most of this time is they seem in the right middle ground where they are careful. So when the government asks for vaccines and masks, then the vast majority of people would do it. But as soon as it's okay to take them off, like that day, people just go back to normal. If the day that the government says restaurants are safe now, you can open restaurants, those restaurants are going to be full. Even in the beginning, we were home for a few weeks, and then we opened and we went to restaurants and, with masks, and then we closed. And it felt like we got much more normalcy than my friends in the States. Overall, if I look at the last 2 years, most of the last 2 years were normal.
Yeah. I think a lot of places in the States got stuck in this unhappy middle where we weren't controlling the virus, we weren't keeping people safe, but we also weren't able to carry on with life as normal. Yeah, it's been frustrating at times, for sure.
Yeah. So to get us into the conversation, I have this opener question that I like to get to know the person and walk us into the journey. So what's something that you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today and guides you as you move in the world?
That's such a good question. And there's a lot of things that are coming to mind. So I'll give you a few. I think one is probably fairly obvious and pretty common that you hear from people who are makers or engineers or designers or whatever. And that's basically just, I learned at an early age. In fact, I don't even remember learning it, but I grew up with an understanding that you didn't have to just accept things the way that they were, whether it was a physical thing that you could tinker with, a change or whatever, or it was a process or a rule or something. Like I just always had this understanding that my parents gave me, which was that like you can play, like the world, like in the world, you can make changes, you can create things, you can design things, you can change things. But I think that tendency could have some negative effects if it hadn't been tempered by a couple of other things that I remember learning. One was a strong orientation toward service. And I don't mean that in like a volunteering, nonprofits. That's obviously important, but I just mean the basic idea that it's important to do work that is in service of others, that truly you're doing it to create value for other people. And that might be in a commercial sense, and that's totally fine. It may not be, but like my family owned a business and I was in Boy Scouts, which like they make you do all these like service projects and do things to help other people. And that was something that was really important for me. And then the final thing is there was a period when I was like in middle school where I like got into some trouble. I like just went through a little period where I was misbehaving, and I think I got caught shoplifting and like some other stuff like that. And I remember that the thing that really hit me and caused me to change my behavior was my dad. So we lived in a small town. We grew up in this really small town in Wisconsin. There were about 1,000 people in our town. And I remember my dad saying, if you do those things, everybody's going to know about it because it's a small town. Everybody's going to talk. They're going to know that you did it. And then that's going to reflect poorly on you, obviously, but it's going to reflect poorly on the rest of the family and like us and like your aunt and uncle and your cousins and like your grandparents. And for me, that was like, okay, like I balanced against the first thing that I said, which is like, the world is yours to play and explore and experiment. But like, you also have this responsibility and there are consequences and impacts. And so I think trying to keep those two things in balance, and then with that orientation towards service as sort of the guiding principle, those are things that I honestly think about probably not every day, but like definitely at least once a week. Those are things that have really stuck with me.
Yeah. In the business world, that happens a lot, where I find, especially in consulting, and in kind of the agency world, conflicts of interests are so common and they're so easy to get into. And you don't even have to mean anything bad. You just have to be not very mindful for a second. And suddenly you got yourself in a position where your interests are really not aligned with your customers. And so very early on, for instance, we decided not to take a cut for referring someone either to an investor or to another service provider. So if we're recommending someone as a service provider, there's never a deal or any sort of kickback, because it's just impossible to be impartial and aligned in that situation. And I think the business world is fraught with these moments, right? If you don't think about them.
Yeah. And this might sound kind of weird because I know that venture capital and like the world of investing is certainly not the natural home for high integrity behavior, but it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to get back into investing in startups. I had been at Google Ventures. I was there for 6 years. I was one of the first people to join the team that supported the startups that we invested in. So not making the investment decisions, but supporting companies. And then I left. I took some time off, did some other projects, and then recently decided to get back into it and started a new firm. But one of the reasons I wanted to do it was because of alignment and because of incentives. And when I was working as a consultant, it was difficult for us to align incentives, particularly around the scoping and sizing and selling of projects. Because of course, my incentive is to have large projects and charge a lot of money. And oftentimes that meant working with big companies where maybe the impact I could have was not as great. But sometimes the right answer is to do less work, like to say, it's better for you if you just if you go on your own and we don't do this thing. And I personally enjoyed working with startups, and startups don't always have the cash to pay for somebody who's a consultant. And so one thing I had seen at Google Ventures is that even though, again, there's certainly some unscrupulous behavior in the world of venture, like at its core, like you do have this great alignment of once we make an investment, we make a deal, anything that I do that helps that company be more successful and be more valuable is good for everybody. And even if the right thing to do is nothing, I still have the incentive to hopefully do that right thing.
Yeah. No, I hear that. I feel like the alignment as an agency. So sprints actually, because I worked at startups first as a product person and
Yeah.
designer. And then I joined an agency, which wasn't mine. And I saw sprints as a way to create better alignment because you were giving the person your whole self for a period of time, and you're guaranteeing learning, and you're going to do whatever it takes to figure out a solution and validate it. So it's entirely reality oriented. And then what we found is the misalignment happens at the end. So after a sprint, there's always a little bit more work to do or walking through. And we don't want to work hourly. Hourly doesn't make sense for us. And they don't want to buy another sprint if they're a small startup. And here is, I wish there was this better model, which I think, of course, if as an investor, it's there. You just help as much as you can. But as an agency, I almost have to invent equity models or something to keep us aligned after a sprint. So it's really interesting. Let's get back into your story. And I read that you're into computers from a young age as well. So you read Wired magazine. And so, yeah, how did you get sucked into computers? How did that kind of evolve through your studies ultimately to working in tech?
Sure. I got into computers through a very unlikely source, which was my grandfather, my grandpa Gibb. I mentioned that my family owned a business. He and his brother, my great uncle, they were the primary owners of the business when my grandpa was still alive. And he was just, he was a businessman, but he was really interested in a lot of things. He was always reading books about different topics. He was always trying to learn things and study things. And just for context, I was born in 1983, and he always had computers. And my dad has actually talked about some of the early computer kits that he bought. And I guess that would put it like in the late 70s, probably around the time of the Apple I and like those types of early computers. And so I don't know where the original like spark came from for him, but he was just always interested in computers. And so when I got to a certain age, he would show me things, or he gave us like one of his computer that he wasn't using anymore. The first computer that I remember was a Mac SE30 that he gave us. So that was probably like in the late 80s or early 90s. And so, yeah, he introduced me to it. And it was interesting because probably until I was like 16 or 17, like my grandpa always knew more about computers than I did. So if I was trying to learn something, I would ask him like, hey, how should I do this? Like, how does this work? And then there was like a crossover point where then I knew more than him. And so I remember that very distinctively because I remember there was a period of time when I hadn't really realized that had happened, but I would continue to ask him, hey, grandpa, what about this? He'd be like, I don't know. I think you know more than I do now. So I just ran with that. Maybe I was like lazy, but I didn't dive deeply into coding. Like I've done some coding. Like I used to do a lot of front-end development and web development stuff, but like never really learned how to like do system architecture, write back-end code. So I wasn't like one of those stereotypical tech nerd kids who was like coding from a young age, but I was just always interested in the ability to make things with the computer. And that was making things in HyperCard and desktop publishing and even just writing and being able to print stuff and then like writing HTML and making early web pages. And so that just continued to build and develop until I got to college. And so the business that my family was a manufacturing business. And so because of that, I think they encouraged me to study engineering in school. So I got to the University of Wisconsin, went into engineering, and just found that the way that it was taught was just so boring. I just like, it just wasn't for me. And so I was like, I'm just going to keep messing around with this like design stuff. At some point I realized that there was this thing called design, that like graphic design or web design, or they had all these funny words for it back then, interactive design or like multimedia design. But I like, had through reading Wired and through other things like that, had figured out that there was something there. So I started dabbling in that and eventually found a professor at University of Wisconsin, and she had a grad student, PhD student. Their research project was related to blogs, like the first blogs. So this was like it was like 2001, 2002 probably. And so I just like latched onto them, and they taught me about like CSS. And I think those were probably the days of BB Edit and movable type and, the
Yep, I
first
remember
versions
those.
of WordPress that were like totally like just an open source project. And yeah, the next sort of big move was deciding to try to make websites on my own. And I eventually started a little business. I created websites for clients. This was still when I was in college. In those days, they were very simple, like
Yeah.
brochureware type websites. And so I remember when I was graduating from college, I was like, well, I'll just apply to agencies, like ad agencies, creative marketing agencies, and get a job making websites. And so I applied for, I don't know how many of those, but a whole bunch of
Mm.
them. Didn't get any of them, like didn't even really get any interviews. I don't know why, but maybe because I didn't go to art school or I didn't have like, my portfolio wasn't like, it was like very functional. I've never been like a super skilled like graphic designer or visual designer. But anyway, I didn't get those jobs. And on a whim, somebody suggested that I apply. There's actually somebody who posted a comment on my blog. So I had posted on my blog that I was looking for jobs. I was going to be moving to Chicago from Wisconsin. And somebody posted a comment. They're like, hey, have you heard of this company, this tech startup called FeedBurner? They're in Chicago. They're pretty cool. It was the only like tech company I applied for. Again, it was all these like ad agencies. And I applied to this one tech company, got the job. And so that was how I accidentally ended up in the tech world. There was a different path, a different fork in the road where I could have ended up in the world of marketing agencies or even media. This weird thing happened and ended up working for a tech startup and, acquired by Google. And we can talk about that story if you want. But that was like the moment that caused me to accidentally find myself working in the tech world.
Yeah, and I remember FeedBurner because I was a tech journalist at the time, and I was
Oh, cool.
assigned by my editor-in-chief to look at this RSS thing that was,
Yeah.
new. And so I was looking at, and I think FeedBurner was definitely one of the solutions that we're looking at. And I think this may have been even pre-acquisition. It would have been in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at FeedBurner recently. Like, I think they're still powering some pretty important services out there. Like, they're still powering RSS for some big sites, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. And RSS, like nobody thinks about it or talks about it, but it is still part of the plumbing for a lot of the web. And this is years and years ago, but I remember before I left Google, every once in a while we would get a report about here's what's going on with FeedBurner these days. And it was like, the numbers were just bonkers. It was like hundreds of thousands or millions of requests per second for the feeds that were still hosted on FeedBurner, part of Google. And it's this plumbing. So it's used to pipe content between different websites and used to pipe content into like email newsletters and a bunch of different stuff. But yeah, there was this period of a few years when it was a thing, the idea that you would have a reader and you could subscribe to these feeds. And it was a great way to stay on top of blogs or other websites that you were interested in. But now it ended up behind the scenes.
I still feel sorry for that. Like, I still think that we went in this aggregator direction with Facebook and Twitter and these platforms. And, there's something really pure about this ability to choose your own reader, choose your own experience, just plug in the content from the sources. I still have an RSS reader that I use. It's
Which one do you use?
So what is it called? Net Newswire.
Okay.
It's
cool. I didn't know that was still around.
Well, they just recently, I think a year ago, released a new Mac version that's actually really kick-ass. And they also have an iOS version now. So it works so fast. I've never seen it. You understand how much craft there is in like normal web software when you load that thing and you suddenly get 10,000 news articles in 2 seconds. But yeah, to me, so these are the good old days. So then you were in Google post-acquisition. And so what does that journey look like from Google to Google Ventures?
Yeah, so I was inside of Google for about 10 years total. The way the acquisitions work at Google, I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time, is there's usually like a team or a department that says, we want to acquire this company. And then they loop in like the M&A, the mergers and acquisitions department to help them assess it as a good value. negotiate the deal, get executive sign off, but it's really driven by an individual team who's like, we're working on this thing. We think if we bought this company, they could help us solve it. And so we were brought into the ads division, Google Ads, the belly of the beast, and specifically like the publisher tools, because as FeedBurner, our main customer was publishers of websites. So we worked, we were kind of on the same team or same department as like AdSense, Google AdSense, Google Analytics in its early days, tools like that. But there was kind of this weird thing, which was that we were in Chicago and Google had a sales office in Chicago. I think they maybe had 50 people. And they had these like two random engineers that were both like really brilliant and really cool. But I think Google like really wanted to hire them for some reason. They had some specific expertise and they were like, we are not leaving Chicago. So like, okay, fine. You can go sit with all these salespeople in Chicago. So there were these two engineers. But like we became the engineering or like product and engineering and design teams in Chicago. And it was like a little bit weird because there weren't really any projects going on in Chicago. So they kind of had to find homes for all of us. And I ended up spending about 2.5 years working on the advertiser side. So working on Google AdWords Editor, which is like kind of the enterprise version of AdWords. And then Google had acquired DoubleClick. So I worked on this tool called DoubleClick Search, which was like basically a tool for large, like if you think about an airline who's going to advertise like on every permutation of flight from here to here, and then all the different permutations of the different copy, super low flights, like great deals on flights, like basically think of the tooling you need to manage that. It's super complex. I was the designer for those products. And this whole time, like there were a couple of UX managers or directors or whatever outside of Chicago who were keeping tabs on us. It was me and there was like a couple other designers in Chicago. And I got in touch with a woman named Margaret Stewart, who was the like head of design for YouTube at the time. And she basically recruited me to move out to the Bay Area and join YouTube. So it was an internal transfer, but YouTube was really run as a separate company. So it felt more like switching companies than it did like just moving internally. So the cool project then was, it was when we were coming up with what's now known as YouTube channels. So this was in like 2010. And if you remember, I don't know if you would, but like around that time, YouTube was like not a very like serious or professional thing. Like it was cat videos and like weird stuff. And you would have a profile page, but there was no notion of a channel. Nobody was like building a business or like, it was very casual, I guess. The leadership of YouTube, they realized that there was an opportunity to create a platform for people who wanted to develop these channels. And so I ended up as the product design lead for YouTube channels. So basically for the core platform, what should it do? What features does it need? What does a YouTube channel even mean? Is it like a TV channel where you turn it on and there's just always something? Or is it more like a playlist? Or is it more like a catalog of content that you can browse? So I worked on that. So I was at YouTube for about a year and a half, worked on primarily on YouTube channels, but a few other projects as well, mostly all related to kind of creators, video creators, video publishers. And then in 2011, GV was basically starting to scale up the team. So Google Ventures started in 2009 as what is known in the industry as a non-strategic corporate venture fund, which means they do not invest for strategic reasons. They invest for purely financial reasons. It's not like they're going to only invest in stuff that is related to Google or non-competitive or whatever. Can literally invest in anything as long as they think it's going to be a good investment. 100% funded by Google. And GV had done something really interesting from the beginning, which was to have partners on the team who would exist solely to support the portfolio companies. And they did it in a very googly way, which was to take designers and engineers and marketers and people who had worked on really successful Google projects and then make them available to the companies that they were investing in. And so they had hired Braden Kowitz, who was the first design partner at GV. So he was the first person in my role. And then a little bit later, they had hired Michael Margolis, who is a researcher who's still there, like a UX researcher, customer researcher. And then they hired me. Again, it was like technically it was a transfer inside. I never had to get new health insurance or change my email address, but it really felt like I was being recruited to go join a different company, a different team. And yeah, honestly, I think it was probably a lot of privilege being a white man, being somebody who looked like the right kind of person for them to hire. It was right place, right time, got the opportunity, joined GV. And pretty much immediately it felt like home, felt like the right level of abstraction, if that makes sense. I always got bogged down at YouTube and at Google on Google ads. Like I always got bogged down in like the big projects and the long timelines and the zillion meetings and all the emails and stuff. But on the other hand, like I didn't want to be at an agency where like I didn't have like ownership or alignment. And so being at GV just really felt like the right fit and allowed me to go deep on one project, but then pull back out, take what I had learned, go do a different project, apply some of those lessons. And so that's what I did. Ended up staying there for about 6 years.
I'm really curious about what was it like? So if we step back to Google and then bring it to GV, what was it like to be a designer at Google at the time? Because I think a lot of us know that there weren't many early in the company's life, and now it's a big thing, but it didn't used to be. And then what does it mean to be a designer at a venture fund? That's another thing that people might have a hard time wrapping their head around.
Yeah, both experiences were unusual, even by the standards of the time, you know, not to mention by today's standards of what it means to be a designer in the tech industry. And I think both of them gave me a really unique and principled understanding of design, of the value of design, the purpose of design, but for different reasons. So at Google, yeah, you're right. There were not very many designers. There were fewer than 200 designers when I joined, which sounds like a lot of designers, but I think there were 7,000 employees at Google at that time. Okay. So 200 out of 7,000, and Google was already the most popular website in the world. Gmail had launched, like, you know, this was a major company already by 2007. And there were only fewer than 200 designers. And I sometimes joke that I snuck in the back door at Google because we got acquired. But at the time, even designers, like you had to have a computer science degree. You had to have, if you didn't, you had to have a master's in HCI or some like really formal, like really intense thing. I studied journalism in college. I've had zero like formal academic proper training in design. And so it was cool that I had that opportunity. The reason I said it was unusual and it gave me a good perspective on design was that designers were, I don't know, I think we really had to figure out how to make ourselves valuable because nobody was asking us to do anything. And when they were, it was really dumb stuff. I don't know, design an icon for something or whatever. But like, the engineers were perfectly happy to just go do everything. They were like, these designers are just slowing us down. They didn't even want like PMs involved sometimes. They're just like, let us run. And so we had to figure out like, how can we be most valuable? What can we do that's going to not only not slow the teams down, but really make it so that they want to work with us, make it so that we are an important additive part of the process. So, you know, that meant being super proactive, not being just a step in the process of, okay, now it's time to do the design, but like looking for opportunities and then bring those to teams. We had to think a lot about data and metrics. So anything that we wanted to do, we had to at least make a strong argument that it was going to move the metrics. And ultimately nothing was going to launch unless we proved that it truly did. But like, we at least needed to say, this is the key metric. This is the OKR or whatever that we're optimizing toward. This is the world today. If we change it like this, here's my argument for why that's going to work. I think it was where my love of research really came from, because even though there were few designers, there was a really strong research team, a very academic, a very serious research team. And working closely with research was one of the ways that we could make the case for the value of design, make the case for why we wanted to make some change to a product or create some new thing or add some new features or whatever. I think having to be somewhat technical, be multifaceted, not just make mock-ups and then hand them off to an engineer and let them build them. But honestly, it sounds crazy in today's world, but like the deliverable that I would give to engineers was usually like a fully clickable, not a hotspot linked mock-up, but actual HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Like it was a front end and then they would connect it in. And that wasn't because I necessarily thought it was made me a better designer or anything like that. It's just, that was the thing that I needed to do in order for the work to have the maximum impact, like just culturally in the organization. So that was Google. GV was totally different.
This definitely brings up a lot of memories from working with engineers, but it's also a kind of an extreme version of that, right? But in a way, it was such a hostile or difficult, challenging environment for designers that you had to come up with some really bulletproof ways of doing things. And the research, it reminds me so much when we were acquired by Motorola in 2012, it was a smart TV startup that I worked at. And we found this group of researchers that were like anthropologists and like various academics. And they opened up their treasure trove, and there were like hundreds of research papers that they wrote about how people watch TV, why they watch TV, what's important, what are the different scenarios in which people watch TV. And it was like, oh my God, it was like candy for someone working on a smart TV product. And they were ignored. Nobody was paying any attention to them.
Yeah. And to bridge the gap between like research findings that can often be quite abstract to what do we do with this? What should we build? Like designers have this ability to take the abstract and make it concrete, and it's overlooked, but I think it's so simple, but I think it's one of the big sources of value for any designer.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And we'll talk about later about the sprint and how that emerged, I think, from a similar kind of environment. But now pivoting to GV, how is that different? And what does it even mean to be a designer at a VC?
Yeah. So at the time, nobody knew what it meant because we were the first firm that was doing it. And so I cannot overstate like how much Braden and Michael did to pave the path for that and figure out what should that role be. And honestly, the leadership of GV at the time, Bill Maris, Joe Kraus, who really believed in this idea of having designers, but nobody really knew what it meant. And basically what it means is like you become a resource to the portfolio companies. So the reason this is important is, for one, obviously you want your companies that you invest in to be as successful as possible. And if you believe that design is an important part of building a successful business, whatever kind of business, then if you can offer design support to a company, then you've increased your chances of success. That's great. Makes sense. There's a second order benefit that took me a while to understand, but is actually much, much more important, which is that venture capital is a weird business where the bottom 99% of the companies that raise money, basically they just need to raise money from wherever they can. Like they got to pay the bills. They got to keep the lights on. It's this existential question of, are we going to be able to raise money to fund the business to continue to operate and grow? The top 1%, the dynamic completely flips. It completely inverts, where they have way more investors who want to give them money than they need. So for that top 1%, the investors are truly competing for the ability to put money into that company. And so if you want to play in that top 1%, which we did at GV and we do with Character, you basically need to have a really compelling sales pitch to a founder, to a startup, to say, here's why you should take our money instead of all these other VC firms' money, and offering something that's unique and something that's valuable, such as design support, such as hands-on support, because most VC support is very surface level. It's making introductions, it's giving advice, but to say, look, we have a designer on our staff. They're going to come to your company and they're going to help you design your product, design your marketing. That's a real differentiator. So structurally, that's what it is. At the time, I really went into GV with the same mindset and approach that I had at YouTube and at Google, which was all the things I was just describing to you, just writing code, being proactive, being scrappy, like relying on research. And so the first like 6-9 months that I was at GV, we would basically find an opportunity within the portfolio. One of the first projects we worked on was this coupon website called Retail Me Not. It's not sexy, not exciting, but this huge, super successful website where you can go, if you're like buying something, I don't even know, whatever, the Crate and Barrel website, you go there, you find like a coupon code, you punch it in, you save money. And they were going to be redesigning their sort of core website, the coupon page. And we just took over that project and basically just did what we would have done if we were at Google and ran research and wrote code and tried things and whatever. But we could see right away, there was no way it was going to scale. That was what eventually led us to develop the design sprint, to bring Jake onto the team, all those things. But that was kind of the initial approach. We're going to just literally do what we did at Google, but we're going to do it for your company. And then realizing really quickly that if you want to do that within a VC firm in a scalable way, in a repeatable way, you need to really think about the engagement model. You almost have to think like an agency and think, what's the client experience? What's the client service that we're providing?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And because you didn't just run post-investment, right? Was it also on the way to investment?
It was all post-investment. And one of the reasons you and I first talked is that you wrote a really interesting article about how running design sprints with startups could help investors make better investment decisions, to de-risk, to get to know a team, to understand the business, could be valuable for the startup to understand what's it going to be like to work with this VC firm. But we did not do that at all at GV. We would talk about it when we were pitching a founder on why they should raise money from us. We would say, this is how we would work with you. It would be like our pitch, like we were an agency. We'd talk about other projects we had done. But no, we did not do that at all. And it's something that I think we're going to be able to do at Character. We're not doing it yet, but it's tricky because in these top 1%, in these really competitive fundraising situations, the founders, it's a very tricky balance. It's like a dance where you're pitching them, you're courting them, and like offering them a free design sprint, that's like cool, that's nice, but they aren't quite willing to spend a whole week with you if they think you might not write a check, So they're protecting themselves a little bit, because what a startup founder does not want is to have done this pre-investment sprint with GV and then GV says, actually, we're not going to invest. Turns out you guys suck. Now that we've seen how the sausage is made, we don't like it. You don't want that situation. We talked about it a lot. We still talk about it a lot. To be quite honest with you, we have not figured it out. We have not cracked that nut, but I think it's a big opportunity.
That's so funny. Because, I think it's the equivalent problem from the agency side, where people are very happy to give equity before we run the sprint as part of the cost of the sprint. Once we run the sprint, that's when we're happy to take equity. We're like, yeah, now let's take equity and we'll help you get it across the finish line. And that's where they say, no, we have this amazing prototype. We can raise money. We don't need to give you equity. And so now sometimes if the idea is promising enough, we will just take equity before we run the sprint with them, even though really the point where I have confidence that it's going to work is after it's been validated in the sprint. But people won't, at that point, it's like you solve too many of their product challenges and now they don't feel like they need you that much anymore. It's interesting. I think it's an equivalent issue. But it sounds like you were a separate team from the kind of investment decision team. At the same time, was there some sort of feedback, some sort of involvement with investment decisions?
Yeah, definitely. So we weren't going out and meeting with a zillion entrepreneurs and deciding who to invest in. But when a startup got to the point of doing a proper pitch to GV, picture the big conference room with a table and everybody gathered around and PowerPoint, here's my pitch. When it got to that point, anybody from any of the teams was encouraged to attend. And then one of the things that was really cool at GV was we used an investment scorecard. So when we were evaluating a company, it wouldn't just be this freewheeling discussion. And you can probably recognize some of the ideas and patterns from sprints too. The decision-making process was very structured. So even for somebody like me who wasn't officially an investor, I got to fill out that scorecard. I got to weigh in. So we participated in that. There was a weekly internal meeting for the whole firm, for everybody at GV. And then every quarter, I think it was quarterly, there was a portfolio review where we would basically go through every single company and just talk about how things are going, what's going well, what are the challenges, what do we need to help them with, et cetera. And we would be quite involved in those. So like that was sort of like keeping tabs on the companies that we had already invested in. We might say, hey, we ran a sprint with this company. We had these questions. Here's what we learned. This thing's going really well, but it turns out we found this new issue. And then the investor who's in the room, who's maybe sitting on the board of that company, they'd say, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I'm so glad that I know that. Then they could go back to the founder, the CEO at their next meeting and say, hey, I heard about this thing you guys found out during the design sprint. I want to make sure you guys are on top of it, whatever. So there definitely was a feedback loop between the investing team and then all of the sort of portfolio support teams.
Yeah. Interesting. It feels like it's becoming more of a thing. I keep reading about design partners, whether in the Valley or even here in Israel. More funds are interested in that. I have friends who are now getting offers from VCs. So
Cool.
It seems like there's something that's happening. And I do think it all started with GV, and it should have been obvious. I always say design is the arm of the company that's in charge of product market fit. That's just what it is.
Yes.
Like we are trying to figure out what people want, how do they live, how they're going to use this, what is this thing going to be, right? And so many investors know that term of product market fit, and they know that it's either on or off. Like you either have it or don't have it, and yet they spend no time understanding how it's achieved when it's achieved. And I'm not saying that you can't get product market fit without design, because that's clearly not true. Google achieved product market fit with, I don't know, who was it? Sergey did the logo in Word or something. But that's a very specific technical challenge where the need was very obvious, but the solution was very technically hard. Those are classic cases where you don't necessarily need design because everybody knows we want better search, right?
Right.
But in almost every other case, research, understanding the human that's going to use this, understanding the market, understanding like what's out there, understanding how to put all of this together. It seems obvious.
I wrote a blog post about this last year about the different types of risk taking at a startup. And there's two sides to the same coin, which is every innovation like has a corresponding risk. So when you look at a company like Google, you say, what's unique about Google? And like you're saying, at its core, solved this very big technical challenge, technical innovation. And on the other side of that is this technical risk. Like lots of other companies had tried search. There was some pretty good search engines out there already. There was skepticism that like it could be dramatically better, but they took this technical risk that led to this technical innovation, very successful. But there are other companies that I think are pretty interesting examples, like Craigslist. Craigslist is very successful, right? It's not technically hard. It is not what anybody would describe as well designed. But what did they do? They innovated on the business model. They said, let's take a thing where there's demonstrated demand, classified ads. Let's fundamentally change the business model. Instead of charging something for every single ad, let's charge nothing for most of the ads and a lot for a few of the ads. And it worked really well. So those, I think, both technical risk and business model risk, or technical innovation, business model innovation, clearly exist outside of what we would all think of as like where design matters. But I think you and I share a very broad view of design, which is that to me, Craigslist is well designed. The first version of Google is well designed. Does it look beautiful? Is it always intuitive? Is it polished and whatever? No, but it solves this problem that people have, and it's very successful. And so to me, Sergey, Larry, like they were designers. They designed Google. Craig, is it Newmark? Like he designed Craigslist. Like he solved a problem. I think at some point, if you zoom out too far, then like design is everything, which also means design is nothing. But I do think it's helpful to like take this broader view and think about what's the problem we're trying to solve and what are the paths that we're following to look for solutions to that problem.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
So I want to get into design sprints, and so we were at this place where we needed a system. It wasn't scalable to do all this work. We needed a better system. Jake was doing already his early design sprint work at Google. How did that come about? And I'm really interested in kind of the evolution of the sprint, just a process I really believe in.
Right. So it was late 2011, early 2012, and Braden and Michael had been at GV for 1.5, 2 years. I'd been at GV for like almost a year at that point. And it was quite obvious like what the problem was, which was we know we can help our portfolio companies, but like you said, we don't know how to scale it. And the current model is not scalable. And we all knew Jake to varying degrees, and we knew about the design sprints he was running. And Jake has written about this in the book and talked about this, but like his early design sprints at Google were basically like a brainstorming workshop with like a hackathon. So, it was like, come up with some ideas, pick out a cool one and try to build it. But he had actually created a job for himself going around Google, going to different teams and running these early sprints with them. And he had worked with Gmail, of course, because he was on that team. He worked with Google Chrome when it was new. Google Meet was actually invented in a design sprint. So like the first prototype of Google Meet came out of a design sprint. I know he worked with X. And so there was sort of like, from talking to him and learning about this, we were like, okay, this model could make sense for us. And I think he came over to GV initially like in sort of a trial capacity. I don't know exactly how it was set up, but he would come and we would run some sprints together and see how it went. And the first sprint that we ran together was with a company called Rocket Lawyer. And this is a far less successful competitor to LegalZoom. So basically the idea is like the vast majority of things that you need a lawyer for, you don't actually need a lawyer. You can use a template and use some software to fill out the docs and like whatever. So Rocket Lawyer did that. And I don't even remember what problems we were trying to solve, but like we ran this design sprint and it was like weeks. Like it was not the 5 days. We kept like showing up at their office and coming back. And it had all the building blocks of the sprint process today, but they were just jumbled together. Like we would do sketching. We would draw stuff on the whiteboard. We would prototype things and test things. And I think we went through a few cycles. Like I remember we ran multiple tests of different concepts, but we did that and we're like, okay, it was messy, but it was pretty good. And the team was like, wow, we got more done with you guys in like however many, 2, 3, 4 weeks than we normally would have in months and months. Jake ran another sprint with a GV portfolio company called Custom Made, which is this really cool, I don't even know if it still exists, but it was this really cool business. It's sort of like a on-demand Etsy or like a custom Etsy. Like you could find like a maker, like a craftsperson and hire them to make you something like custom table or whatever. I know that he went to Boston and ran a sprint with them. I wasn't in that one. But basically the first few sprints that we did, they did not resemble the sprints that we know today, but they contained all those same elements. And I think more importantly, they contained the core philosophy of focused, structured time as a team to try to come together and solve the most critical issues, the most important questions that a company is facing. And I think also like really significantly, they all included research. Sometimes I joke that like design sprints are just this like elaborate trick to get companies to run research. Because I think research is so valuable. Yeah. Like you were saying about your example at Motorola, but like a lot of people don't want to do it, like, or they don't think it's valuable, or they don't believe in it or whatever.
They think they know enough. Like I think the fundamental thing is they think they know enough, and you have to convince them, this is the trickiest part, that if they listen to some experts, that might feel different at the end of the day. And in fact, they always will feel different after talking to a few experts.
Yeah. And in sprints, like definitely experts, but even more importantly, customers, because you may have a lot of data about what your customers are doing, but when you're sitting there either in person or over Zoom or whatever, and somebody is reacting to a thing that you made, it is overwhelming. It can be overwhelmingly positive or overwhelmingly negative. But once you do that, you realize how much data there is. The bandwidth is so wide. There's just so much data being thrown at you that as long as you have like a way to deal with it, a way to manage it, you like have a reasonably good attitude about it, like you can't unsee it because it's just so valuable. So that was really important. But basically, I don't know. I don't think there was ever a moment where we were like, okay, we're just going to do sprints now. It just happened. It was just such a better model that starting really after those first couple, like every time we were going to engage with a portfolio company, it was just like, let's run a sprint. And we got very deliberate about experimenting with the process itself. Like I mentioned, the first ones were like a little bit longer. We would try really short sprints. We tried splitting the sprint over 2 weeks. I think we called it a 3-and-3 sprint. So it was 3 days 1 week, 3 days the next week. We did sprints where we all split up as a team. And I worked with one company, Jake worked with one, Braden worked with one. And then we like did other sprints where like we all worked together to see like what was better. And yeah, just I think both at the macro level of those types of structural changes and experiments, but also at the micro level, experimenting and tweaking the process. We just had this attitude that we should experiment to try to make the process as good as possible. And really only when we started to write about it, did we try to codify things? Did we say, okay, what is the quote unquote right way? What do we believe after all the experiments is the best way to do this? Yeah. We only really had to make those decisions because we were going to write it down and we knew that it would have some longevity.
Yeah, this reminds me of Socrates and some philosophers who are very much against writing their ideas down because they're constantly evolving and writing them down would kill them. But at the same time, how do you communicate to someone else? So I love this idea of constant experimentation. When I talked to Jake, I said, like I always felt like the main innovation in the sprint is that it's a thing. And just by being a thing, that means that you can iterate on it, right? As opposed to just doing design. It's such a simple way because when I read the sprint, I was like, yep, this is a lot of the things that we do. Usually it takes us 3 weeks to do all of these steps, but it's interesting that they claim you can do it in a week. Doesn't seem impossible. Let's read how they do it. And then you go like, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course you can do it in a week if you do it like this and let's try. It means that we now have something to work with. And every time we run a sprint, we can say, oh, in a sprint like this, maybe we could add this added exercise in between this and that, or maybe in a sprint like that, we do 2 sprints in a row, or it's such an open source moment, again, because there's a code base to start from, because there's something.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. Yeah, there's 2 other components that I think are really important. One is that a lot of times we say design sprint, and that's the official name, but like we also go out of our way to not talk about design too much. The book is not called Design Sprint. It's just called Sprint. Like we very intentionally did not talk about design a lot. And I think that has actually been huge because it just allows us to have a different kind of conversation with people about working together. It's not about, hey, we want to improve the design of this, or we want to do this design thinking thing. It's like, hey, like you guys have this problem, or you're thinking of launching this product and you're not quite sure like what features to include. Let's run a sprint and figure it out. Like it just creates this common vocabulary. And then the other thing is that the fact that it is a finite length is really, really powerful because it allows you to scale. And it's 5 days. So like you can't scale infinitely, but you know what it's going to look like to scale. And that's something that we ran into a lot with Character and with pitching our investors, right? Our limited partners who would say, this sprint thing is great, but like, how do you scale? How are you going to scale the portfolio? And to be able to say, A, we did it already at GV. We know what that feels like. And we know what that looks like. And B, like, it's just math. Like the maximum length of the sprint is always going to be 5 days. So let's just do some math and figure out like, how often does a company want to run a sprint with us? Like how many companies are there? How many weeks in the year are there? How many people do we need? It's so impossible to scale those things if you don't have that finite time frame. And I think that's a big part of why other VC firms haven't brought in designers or engineers or other types of really hands-on support for their portfolio. They don't have that way of looking at things. They've never worked with clients. They've never had to like design engagements in that way.
Yeah. Sprint is definitely much more predictable in this wonderful way. Like I can say, put it on the calendar. I can tell you what date you're going to have like a tested prototype. It's that date. Like, and you're like, what? How can you, like, you never put an end date on it, something like that. It was like, no, on that date, you're going to have a prototype. It might not be perfect, but you'll have it and you'll know what people think about it.
And engineering projects are notoriously difficult to put a timeline on. So to have this bit of clarity, this
Yeah.
oasis of predictable scheduling in this desert of unpredictability and complexity of projects is so refreshing for people.
And in the most chaotic of places too, because we often go into a sprint and like you have four main stakeholders and every one of them has a completely different vision for the project, like completely contradictory version of the product. And still on the fifth day, we have a tested prototype.
Yeah. When I do presentations about sprints, there's a slide that I show at the beginning, which is about on the mapping day, I show like 5 people in a room and then like a speech bubble, and like everybody's speech bubble has like a different map. And it's true. Everybody comes into a project and they have a different map of the world. They have a different set of assumptions or understandings about what the project is or what it's going to be like. And so when you are just having a meeting or a conversation, or you're not doing something like a sprint, but you're saying, let's have a planning meeting and just talk about this, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of disagreement and a lot of dysfunction because everybody has a different map. But if you can bring those maps out of the thought bubble and bring it into a piece of paper and a whiteboard and a Miro board and whatever, that alone is really clarifying for people.
Yeah. And there's this whole discipline of graphic facilitation that I learned about after I got into sprints. It's essentially the same thing. It's like, oh, apparently when you put it out there on a whiteboard, it's much easier to reach an agreement because now you can capture everyone's ideas and find ways to kind of account for them. I want to hear about the book, but the book itself is really exciting as a product in the way it's designed, in the way it's put together. What was it like to create it? And did you expect it to be as big as it is?
I think that once we got to a certain point in the creation of the book, we became cautiously optimistic that it could be really great. Like, I don't remember where that crossover point was, but there was some point where we're like, this could be something like this really could be a thing that people get excited about. I think Jake always wanted to write a book. Like he loves writing. His mom is an English teacher. He grew up writing stories and stuff. I've always loved writing, but I never wanted to write a book. It wasn't like a goal of mine. It wasn't like a bucket list thing. So Jake, me and Braden, our names are on the cover of the book. Jake and I did all the writing for the most part. Braden wrote some parts of it, and Daniel and Michael contributed as well. Daniel Burka and Michael Margolis. But Braden approached it as like a product. Like I said, he did some of the writing, not a ton, but he just thought about the layout of it and the format of it. We didn't run proper sprints to write the book, but we used a lot of the components of design sprints in the writing of the book. That included the equivalent of lightning demos. Like that included going to bookstores and buying tons of books and looking at not just what were the words that were written, but how were they laid out, and what was even the binding, what were the different types and formats, like the bigger formats versus smaller formats. We produced a lot of different versions of things. So the equivalent of sketching and deciding, we would in some cases have 3 or 4 different competing beginnings of a chapter that were written by different people on the team, and we would distill them down. We tested the book with test readers, and then we really 10x'd that concept with Make Time, where we shared the book with thousands of people before we published it. So I don't know, we really did approach it as a product, but then there came a point when we were in production mode where we had to write it, and there was a lot of writing to do. And that was where I think a lot of our ideas about focus work and about blocking calendars and about distraction-free things that had been sparked by the sprints themselves, we really had to put those to the test. And I could probably look back on my calendar. I had days and days where I literally just had the entire day blocked out, like writing, not doing anything else. I'm just writing, waking up early, starting first thing in the morning, writing for hours. So that was interesting too, was having these two sides of, I almost think about it as design versus production, right? Like the what is it? Like, what does it need to do? What problems is it solving? And then the production mode of, okay, we've basically figured out what it is. Like, even simple things like it wasn't obvious that the whole book should be a step-by-step, right? Like we could have written the book that was 6 chapters of 6 different sprints, right? But we decided, no, we want somebody to start on page 1 and read through. And by the time they get to page 350 or whatever, they've read about an entire sprint, how to do a sprint. So making those structural decisions. But then once those things were set, then it was like, okay, time to shift into this other mode of getting the work done and sitting down and cranking away.
It's super exciting. And it looks like you got some maybe inspiration from Steve Krug's books that are kind of illustrated in a funny way.
Yeah.
But the book is such a delight that it's hard to not get excited just holding it in your hands. And I think I may win an award for most versions of the Sprint book that I own, because I have the hard copy, the soft cover, like the Kindle. I think I may have a PDF. I definitely have the iBooks version, just for like different, because I need it all on all my devices. But yeah, it's just a really fun book to open. It always brings a smile to my face. So there's two other big topics that we need to cover. One is the book Make Time, and then I think finally Character, the new venture fund that you started. I'd love to hear about your experience writing. The full title is Make Time, How to Focus on What Matters Every Day. I don't know if you can see it behind me, but it's on my shelf.
I spotted that.
Yeah, but there's some things I'll introduce what I really like about it, and then I would love to hear, why did you write it? And what are some maybe underappreciated lessons that you think people are not really paying attention to? They're still hidden there because it's a treasure trove of tips. But I'll start by saying I love the kind of framing of like fighting against the defaults, because it is true for everything, but definitely in how we manage our lives and our time, is they creep in and they're like created by someone else. They're not thoughtful. The other thing that I took from it absolutely is this idea of the daily highlight, this one thing that you can really accomplish every day, that you just say, this is the thing that I want to absolutely achieve today. And then a minor tip that, just to give you people a flavor of how many different tips it is, not drinking coffee first thing in the morning, but actually letting yourself wake up naturally and then drinking coffee for maximum effect. And I do this, it made a big difference in my life. And actually, because I love to drink coffee right first thing in the morning, I drink decaf first thing in the morning, and then I save the first cup of coffee to around 10 a.m. But
I like the decaf hack. That's very smart.
Yeah, because I need the hot liquid.
Yeah,
but
such a great routine.
So tell me, like, what made you and Jake decide to write this book, and what do you secretly love about this, about the book that you wish more people paid attention to?
One thing that's crazy about it is how quickly we wrote it after Sprint. It didn't feel all that quick at the time. It was basically like Sprint came out, and then the next year. Yes, Make Time is like, it's a cousin to Sprint for sure. The origin of it is that Jake and we had a sidebar like throughout the whole period where we were running sprints, which was like us talking about how we were spending our time and managing our energy and our focus, like both in sprints, but also outside of sprints, and like taking inspiration from sprints. And then, we were just always like sharing tips with each other. If something would happen in a sprint, we would have a really unhealthy lunch and then notice that like the team's energy would crash in the afternoon after lunch, or something, basic things like that. Or how if we weren't really adamant that people turn off their devices and be present and focused, like how the whole thing would just fall apart. And we just got this idea that there needs to be this complement of, okay, you do this stuff in a sprint and then you do this stuff the rest of the time. These are the things that you do when you're not in a sprint. But it's a very different book. It's kind of the same style, the same tone, like illustrations by Jake, a lot of similarities. We even use some of the same typefaces, but it's a very different book because Sprint is a book about one thing and Make Time is a book about a lot of things. And Make Time was also like, in Sprint, we felt like we were just writing down what we were doing, but in Make Time, we had to make things up. Not to say that we like all of the tactics in the book were things that we had been doing, but the concept of the infinity pools and the busy bandwagon and the defaults that you mentioned, those were constructs. Those were mental models we had to create for the book in order to illustrate why this stuff mattered. The process of writing it was very different, and I think the book is very different. You touched on the daily highlight, and Jake has actually said to me, I wish that we had called the book The Daily Highlight, because that is the single thing that has really resonated for people, that very consistently people have talked about how the highlight is so simple but so powerful and has made a huge difference for them.
Yeah. I do these daily highlights, and I love deep work and focused work. And then I have days that I call Drano days, which are days of unclogging the myriad of small stuff that are blocking,
Oh, that's so good.
the flow.
That's so good.
So I have one Drano day a week, and it's appropriate name because those kind of drain you because you have to do a lot of annoying little tasks. But it keeps
and you're unclogging
stuff flowing.
Perfect.
Yeah,
that's really clever. It's really good.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about it because I also talked to David Allen about getting things done, and there's many things that I think because our world is speeding up all the time, and it really is much faster than it was in the early 2000s when the book came out, that really needs a rethinking around personal productivity and time management, and I think we've gone a long way with Make Time to create something that's realistic and more organic to what we can actually accomplish. So I want to talk about character, and I'd love to hear like your thoughts first on why start a venture fund, why call it character, what makes character special, and then maybe anything that you can tell us about your kind of investment strategy or ideology, what makes a good investment.
So character is both very selfish in the sense that it's designed to create a business model for the work that I want to do, but also it embodies that idea of service and that lesson that I learned at GV about how the most exciting, most successful startups, they can raise money from anybody, and sort of that inverted competitive dynamic. It combines both of those things. It balances both of those things. And the way that it does that is we sort of took the core, the essence of what we were doing at GV, which is running design sprints with startups. And we really built a whole VC firm around that. So it's very small, hopefully get bigger, but right now it's very small. It's me and Jake. And then we have a partner named Eli, who is much more of a traditional investor. We have just 4 advisors who are very part-time. They help us out with specific areas that we don't know a lot about, but we know are important. Things like branding and communications or building online communities, things like that. We, at the core, like it's basically this very simple pitch, which is, when you're just starting out, you're building something, product market fit is the thing that matters the most, like you said, and that's the domain of designers. So you should raise money from us instead of those other firms because we know how to do this stuff. We've been doing it for years. We have a great track record, and we're going to actually be doing the work with you hands-on. So that's really at the core, but it expands out from there in some really interesting ways. And I'm really excited to explore those over the next few years, including that idea that we touched on, which is, how can you run sprints before you make an investment? Or maybe the way that looks for us is not completely before we make an investment, but maybe we make a really small investment, we run a sprint, and then we make a big investment in some of the companies. There's this really interesting thing that we've seen. We started to see at GV, but we've seen really clearly at Character, which is that because the book has done so well, because we've presented at so many conferences and universities and we have articles and videos and all this stuff, that there's a lot of people who reach out to us, who want to talk to us, who maybe they're not actively fundraising, but they just want our help, or they want our feedback, or they want us to know about what they're doing. And that's a huge advantage, because the worst thing for an investor is to be in the auction, basically. For a founder to say, I'm raising money, there's 15 different VC firms who are all interested. Who's going to offer me the highest price? That's great for founders, but it's bad for VCs. And so for us to be able to have this really organic way of talking to founders outside of the auction is something that we're able to do because of the audience, the community, this sort of movement, the brand around Sprint. So those are the big ideas. I think the other thing that's really interesting and different is that we have closed that gap between like at GV, we were talking about the investing team and the sort of portfolio support team. And you were asking about feedback and how do we collaborate. We've completely closed that gap. So like me and Eli, we are the general partners, which means we're responsible for the day-to-day management. We have fiduciary, responsibility to make investment decisions, all those things. We're also the people who are running sprints. We're also the people who are in the room with our companies. Jake is like a little bit on the periphery of that, but it's just a much tighter feedback loop, and it's a much more integral role for us as investors / sprint facilitators, designers, writers, whatever we want to call ourselves. That's been really interesting. I think it makes us both better investors and better sprint facilitators. And yeah, we have a pretty broad sort of investment approach. Basically, if a company is just about the technology, or in the case of, we talked about Craigslist, like just about the business model, we probably aren't going to be able to move the needle on their success. They'll be successful whether or not we run sprints with them. But these days, a lot of the low-hanging fruit of can you build a search engine that works, like those things have been figured out already. So these days, like most new tech companies they're actually like behavior companies. They're really like, can we get people to do this new thing, right? So like Uber, who we invested in at GV, or Slack, we invested in at GV. These companies, in order for them to be successful, they have to get their customers to do a new thing. They already have the motivation. People already need rides. People already want to stay in touch with their coworkers. But what they're betting on is not like this, amazing new technology. They're betting on like basically being able to design a product that shifts behavior in a way that helps customers reach whatever goal they have. And so that's kind of our lens. What is the behavior shift that this company is trying to create? And do we like the world that leads to? Because we have the luxury of not investing in things where we think that they're trying to create a world that we don't want to be a part of. But more importantly, I think, can we help them make that shift?
I think of this as the design of human systems as opposed to design of technological systems. Is if you need the human to be, if the human is a critical component of the system that you're trying to build, then design becomes super important, right? So if you're building a dating app, you can't not have great design. If you're building social media or a meditation app or whatever, you have to have the human like it. So I have a final question. I know we're almost out of time. So in his TED Talk, Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being a modern day dry, hey, we'll give you a little bit of information and you make up your mind. And a sermon is more of an urgent plea for someone to examine and change their life in some way and really improve their lives in some way. This is my closing question for every guest is if you had a chance to give a short sermon for something or someone, it could be a business, it could be a startup, you decide who you want to talk to. It could really change their lives, something that you feel very passionately about. What would it be? What would be your sermon?
I think it's probably the sermon that I've been giving or attempting to give for the last, 5 years, which is time is the most valuable resource that we have because it's the only thing we can't get more of. And so the most important decisions that we make are what we spend our time on. And the world is not set up to make that easy. It's not set up to optimize for the things that matter to us as individuals, because how could it, right? We're all different. We all want different things. But it's important to figure that out. And it's possible if you understand that there are defaults that control a lot of what we do and that the defaults can be changed, that they can be redesigned. And so whether that's running a sprint, whether that's choosing to raise money for a new company, so you've bought yourself time to work on something that's new, whether it's structuring your day in a certain way, setting a daily highlight, removing email from your phone, big, little, whatever. I think the key message is that you owe it to yourself to find ways to sort of design your life and design your time so that you can focus on the things that matter most.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me. This was great.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.